Hello everybody and welcome to the second video in our series of videos on the American War of Independence. Today we are going to be looking at some of the causes of the War of Independence. As always, we begin with our learning outcomes, so by the end of this presentation you guys should know what the 7 Years' War was and two consequences of this war for British-American relations. Second, you guys should know three acts that led to discontent in the colonies of America. And third, you guys should know who the Sons of Liberty were, their motto, and what they achieved. So one of the most important wars, not only in American history, perhaps in world history up to this point, was the 7 Years' War. And this went on from 1756 to 1763. And it sets off a chain of events that led not just to the American War of Independence, but also the French Revolution, the 1798 Rebellion, the successful slave revolution in Haiti, the rise of Napoleon, and also the subsequent wars of independence in the rest of the Americas. So what was the 7 Years' War? Well, there were many areas where the war took place, but for our study, we only need to focus on the fighting that happened here in America. Here it was a war between the combined forces of the British and the American colonists against the French and the majority of the native tribes. So while Britain had the 13 colonies, France also had territory in America. And while it appears larger than the British territory, it was less settled, with only a few towns like Quebec and Montreal up here in Canada and New Orleans in the south. The reason then that the natives sided with the French in this war is because they feared that the colonists might expand past the Appalachian mountains. The French weren't really settling, whereas the American colonists had settled and were pushing further and further to the west, and they feared that, unchecked, that they would continue to push further west. However, the British and the American colonists won, with Britain taking Canada, which you can see here, which now is coloured in yellow, and Spain then was given the rest, as seen here in green, which would be known as kind of the Louisiana territory. But even though they won the war, there were two real negative consequences of the war that splintered the relationship between the victorious British and American colonies. First, the British signed the Treaty of Paris in 1763 at the end of the war. When a war ends, the treaty is signed. And in this treaty, they included the Proclamation Line. So this was a line that said colonists were not allowed to expand past. You can see it here. It is the red line on the map, and the colonists were very unhappy about this. The British also began to station troops here along the Proclamation Line for defensive purposes. But the colonists really mistrusted them because there had been no defensive troops there when there was enemy soldiers, the French. So they were suspicious as to why they would put in troops there other than to control the colonists. The second consequence of the war was that it cost a lot of money for the British, and it increased their national debt. And the British insisted that the colonists must be taxed to cover the cost of the war and for keeping the British troops in America along the Proclamation Line. In this vein, they began to introduce new taxes. The first was the sugar tax of 1764, introduced under the Sugar Act, which worked with the Navigation Act, which we saw in our last video, to stop smuggling so the British would get paid the revenue or the taxes from the importation of sugar. They also introduced the Quartering Act in 1765, which meant that the colonists had to provide quarters for British soldiers. The colonists were unhappy with having these acts passed on them without their consent. And while these acts were unpopular, another act called the Stamp Act, passed in 1765, caused violent protests from the colonists. The Stamp Act meant that Americans had to have newspapers and legal documents stamped by the government official in the colony, who then made them pay for stamping the documents or the newspapers. So in Boston, which we met last time, up here in the Massachusetts colony, a group known as the Sons of Liberty began to organize violent protests where they attacked government officials, forcing them to resign and burning potential offices. The Sons of Liberty went by the motto "no taxation without representation." And this meant that the British Parliament and the King George III, had no right to tax the Americans, as the Americans had no elected representatives in the British Parliament in Westminster, in London. The campaign against the Stamp Act was actually successful, and the British repealed or removed the Act the following year in 1766. However, not wanting to lose face or set a precedence that any protests against laws would be successful in the future, the King George III, who was the King of England at the time, passed the Declaratory Act. And this said that he could levy any tax he wanted in the future, including in the colonies. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. So now you guys should know what the 7 Years' War was. It was a war in which the Americans and the British fought against the French and the majority of the native tribes. Two of the consequences of it for British and American relations, which would have been the taxes that were introduced and the dislike at the Proclamation Line. Then there was 3 acts that led to discontent: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Quartering Act. And finally, you should know who the Sons of Liberty were, their motto, "no taxation without representation," and what they achieved, which was the repeal of the Stamp Act. Thanks for watching. Hope you guys got something good from this video.